Okay, so get this. We are diving deep into the world of human genome editing today. We're talking like rewriting the source code of life itself, people. I mean, you know I love a good sci-fi thought experiment as much as the next person, but this is real deal research we're getting into today.
Absolutely, and we're focusing on some really fascinating sources too.
Right. We're diving deep into human genome editing, science ethics, and governance. It's a report from the National Academies Press.
Published back in 2017.
Yeah, 2017. So it gives a really solid baseline for where the field was and where it was headed.
And what's really wild is just how much progress has been made since then, even just a few years later. And it's incredible how much things have advanced.
Which is why I am so pumped that we're also looking at this other source, an article called Advancing Genome Editing with Artificial Intelligence: Opportunities, Challenges, and Future Directions.
It's a mouthful.
It is, but it's going to be fascinating. Basically, we're giving you the express lane to understanding how this tech actually works, what it can achieve, and what it means for us to be, tinkering with something as fundamental as our DNA.
You ready to get into it?
Oh, absolutely. Let's do it. Okay, first things first. What exactly is genome editing? I feel like I should be picturing like a microscopic pair of scissors or something.
You're surprisingly not far off, actually. Imagine being able to target a very specific sequence of DNA, snipping it out, and then you can even go in and replace it with something else. We're talking about editing the blueprints of life.
Whoa, okay. So CRISPR-Cas9, that's the superstar tool that's making all this possible, right?
Exactly. CRISPR is like this revolutionary pair of molecular scissors, and they're guided by this programmable RNA.
Hmm.
It's incredibly precise, and it's taken the field by storm since those first publications back in 2012, 2013.
Wow. So instead of just studying genes, we can actually go in and make changes. That's both mind-blowing and like a little bit terrifying.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so interesting. And the applications are huge. Like, we're talking everything from basic research, just understanding how genes work, to developing new disease treatments. And, well, we'll get to that later.
Okay, now I'm really curious. Let's start with the less ethically complex stuff.
Yeah.
How is genome editing being used in research right now?
Okay, so think of it this way. Scientists can now use CRISPR to actually create cell and animal models of diseases. That means they can study stuff like cancer in a much more controlled way, and that is so valuable for developing new therapies.
So it's like having a much clearer window into how these diseases work at like their most basic level.
Yeah, exactly.
That's huge. So what about treating diseases, in actual humans?
Okay, so that's where things get really, really exciting. And it's where the potential of this technology really starts to shine. We're talking about potentially curing genetic diseases that we basically thought were untreatable before.
Wow.
Like, imagine using gene editing to go in and correct the single gene mutation that causes cystic fibrosis.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're not just talking about managing symptoms or, trying to make life more manageable. We're talking about actual cures.
Potentially, yeah.
Mhm.
And there are two main categories when we talk about applying this to humans.
Hmm.
Somatic cell editing and germline editing.
Right, right. Okay, remind me, what's the difference there again?
So somatic cell editing, that involves modifying the DNA of cells that aren't involved in like making eggs or sperm. So those changes that you're making, they aren't passed down to any future generations.
Okay.
It's like, if you had a book and you corrected a typo in your copy, but it didn't change the original manuscript.
Right, right. Okay. And so this is where, like, most of the researches, most of the clinical trials that are happening right now, they're focused on somatic cell editing.
Exactly. Yeah, the National Academies report, they actually highlight clinical trials that are already using edited human cells to tackle diseases like cancer, HIV, things like that.
Right.
And there's promising research into using CRISPR to treat sickle cell disease by editing a patient's blood stem cells.
So we're already seeing, like, the potential for this technology to, really cure people in a very real way.
That's amazing. Okay, but you mentioned germline editing earlier, and that's the one that makes everyone, like, kind of nervous,
It
right?
definitely raises a whole other set of questions, yeah.
Yeah.
So unlike somatic cell editing, germline editing, that's when we're talking about modifying the DNA in eggs, sperm, or embryos.
So then any changes that you make would be passed down
Exactly.
to future generations.
Think of it like this. If you go back to the book analogy, it would be like correcting that typo in the original manuscript.
Oh, okay.
So every copy of that book printed afterwards would include that correction. Okay, yeah, that's a much bigger deal. Ethically, I can see why.
Right.
And the National Academies report, they get into all that, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. A huge chunk of that report is dedicated to, like, unpacking all of the ethical considerations around human genome editing,
Hmm.
especially when we're talking about germline editing.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, because we're talking about changes that could have, like, that could impact generations to come. We
Yeah.
don't know the unintended
A
consequences.
lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
And the report really doesn't shy away from acknowledging those concerns.
So what are some of like the specific ethical dilemmas that the report, like what are the experts grappling with here?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is just like, where do you draw the line between treatment and enhancement? Is it okay to use gene editing to prevent a really serious disease? Sure. But what about conditions that are less severe? And then where does it go from there? Like, what about enhancing abilities beyond the typical range?
Right, like gene editing to make someone taller or more musically gifted or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, that gets a little murky.
Yeah. The report really does a good job of grappling with those questions, and they emphasize the need to have, broad societal discussion on this.
Totally, because it's like opening Pandora's box. It's like, where do you even start and who gets to decide?
Yeah, and then on top of that, the report also talks about the potential for exacerbating inequalities that are already in place.
Oh,
What if these technologies are only accessible to wealthy people?
yeah.
Could we see a future where the rich are basically designing their children while everyone else is left behind?
It's like something out of a dystopian sci-fi novel.
Yeah, it sounds far out, but it's definitely something to think about.
It's a valid concern. We already see, like, with new technologies, who they can sometimes, widen that gap between the haves and the have-not.
For sure. Yeah, it's definitely something to consider. And the report really stresses how important it would be to make sure there's equitable access if and when these technologies are ready for everyone.
Okay, so we've got these, like, huge ethical questions already, right? And then we add artificial intelligence to the mix.
Right. And that's where this other article comes in, because it seems like you can't have a conversation about technology these days without talking about AI. And yeah, gene editing is no exception.
So how is it being used in this field?
Well, think about it. Gene editing, it requires making these insanely precise changes to these already very complex molecules.
Right.
AI can actually help researchers analyze like mountains of genetic information to figure out what the best targets are for editing, predict what might happen if you edit the wrong thing, and even like design even more effective gene editing tools.
So it's like having a supercomputer assistant kind of guiding this whole process, making it faster, more efficient, hopefully safer.
That's the goal.
But I have to imagine AI has its own set of, ethical quandaries that it's bringing to the table here.
Absolutely. And
Yes.
the article does a good job of pointing this out. It talks about how important transparency, accountability, and oversight are going to be if we're going to use AI in gene editing.
Yeah.
Because we really need to make sure these algorithms are behaving themselves, especially given how big the consequences could be if something goes wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It feels like we are really on the cusp of something like truly revolutionary
Yep.
with this technology. But it's clear that like we need to like tread carefully
100%.
and like think about what we're doing every step of the way.
And the National Academies report, they really emphasize that. They really hit home that we need to have these ongoing conversations
Right.
between scientists, policymakers, ethicists, the public, everyone.
Everyone. Yeah, it's not just a science issue. This has like societal, ethical, like it impacts everyone.
Totally. We need to be having these like really open and honest discussions about what it means to potentially be able to do this.
Yeah.
This isn't something that can be decided in a lab somewhere.
Yeah. It really highlights how complex this whole thing is. We're not just talking about like the next cool gadget here. This is like
Yeah.
potentially, reshaping what it means to be human.
Hmm.
So knowing all of that, how do we move forward responsibly? Did the National Academies report like offer any guidance on that?
They did, yeah. They actually have a whole framework for how to regulate clinical trials for germline editing, and it's definitely very cautious.
Okay, good. I am all for caution when we're talking about something as like, profound and potentially impactful as altering the human germline. So what does this framework, like what does it actually say?
Well, so for one thing, it says that you shouldn't even think about doing a trial, like a heritable genome editing trial, unless there's just no other option.
Oh,
Like if there's any other reasonable way to address this, gene editing is off the table.
so it's not like the first thing you jump to. If there are other ways to like address a serious disease or medical condition, you try those first.
Exactly. Yeah, and even then, it sets a really, really high bar. Like they're saying you should only be using this to prevent a serious disease,
Yeah.
not for like, cosmetic reasons or like we were talking about before, enhancements.
So no designer babies with like, superhuman strength or perfect pitch.
Not if we're following these guidelines.
Okay, good to know.
And another thing, they really stress that there needs to be solid scientific evidence. It can't just be like, oh, we think this gene might be involved. You need to know for sure that that gene is what's causing the problem.
So yeah, no rushing into this. We need like a mountain of research before we even think about making these kinds of changes.
Yes, exactly. And if you do make a change, the goal should be to give someone a gene variant that we already know is a healthy one that already exists in the population. Like you're trying to correct something, not create something totally new.
Right. You're basically like fixing a typo, not like writing a whole new sentence in the genetic code.
Exactly.
Okay. It sounds like they are really advocating for like a proceed with extreme caution approach here.
Yes, very much so. And, beyond all the science stuff, they also talk about how important it is to have like really broad public engagement before we even think about going down this road.
I love that because it's not just a scientific decision to make, right? This is something that like we as a society we need to be talking about this, like all of the ethical and societal dimensions of this.
Exactly, because the future of human genome editing, it's not something that should be decided by like a handful of people in a lab somewhere. It's
Yeah.
something we need to figure out together.
Well, that is certainly a lot to think about. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We went from like the very basics of how this technology works to like its potential for treating diseases all the way to these like really complex ethical considerations. And of course, we couldn't forget about AI, which just adds a whole other layer of complexity to the mix.
It really is mind-blowing stuff. And whether you're excited or maybe a little bit apprehensive about the future of human genome editing, I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of what's at stake.
Absolutely. And if you want to learn more, definitely check out our website. We'll have links to both the National Academies report as well as that article about AI and gene editing. It's all super fascinating stuff, and I highly recommend checking it out.
And if you're on social media, let us know what you think. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, all the usual places.
Yeah, let's keep this conversation going. Use the hashtag the deep dive, and share your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of human genome editing. It's a topic that's going to be with us for a long, long time.
Absolutely. Until next time.